Hello, listeners, should I say, rather than viewers, but maybe you are watching the candles while I read. This is our third bedtime story session, and I apologize for not doing it over the weekend, but things get quite busy. So, for those of you who've been tuning in, I hope you're enjoying it. We are currently still in chapter 2, and just a little catch up. Tom and Pug were actually catching up with Martin Longbow, who is the Duke of Cryde's hunt master. And they're a little bit nervous because today is the day of choosing, where all the craft masters choose the children who've come of age to then come into their service within the castle to master up. So get comfortable, grab your cuppa, and let's get back to the story, the bedtime story. The boys stood in the courtyard. It was midsummer, the day that ended one year and marked the beginning of another. Today, everyone in the castle would be counted 1 year older. For the milling boys, this was significant, for today was the last day of their boyhood. Today was the choosing. Pug tugged at the collar of his new tunic. It wasn't really new, being one of Thomas's old ones, but it was the newest Pug had ever owned. Maggia, Thomas's mother, had taken it in for the smaller boy to ensure he was presentable before the Duke in his court. Maggia and her husband, Meager the cook, were as close to being parents to the orphan as anyone in the keep. They tended to his ills, saw that he was fed, and boxed his ears when he deserved it. They also loved him as if he were Thomas's brother. Pug looked around. The other boys all wore their best, for this was one of the most important days of their young lives. Each would stand before the assembled craftsmasters and members of the Duke's staff, and each would be considered for an apprentice's post. It was a ritual, its origins lost in time, for the choices had already been made. The crafters and the Duke's staff had spent many hours discussing each boy's merits with one another and knew which boys they would call. The practice of having the boys between 8 and 13 years of age work in the crafts and services had proved a wise course over the years in fitting the best suited to each craft. In addition, it provided a pool of semi-skilled individuals for the other crafts should the need arise. The drawback to this system was that certain boys were not chosen for a craft or staff position. Occasionally there would be too many boys for a single position, or no lad judged fit even though there was an opening. Even when the number of boys and openings seemed well matched, as it did this year, there were no guarantees. For those who stood in doubt, it was an anxious time. Pug scuffed his bare feet absently in the dust. Unlike Thomas, who seemed to do well at anything he tried, Pug was often guilty of trying too hard and bungling his tasks. He looked around and noticed that a few of the other boys also showed signs of tension. Some were joking roughly, pretending no concern over whether they were chosen or not. Others stood like Pug, lost in their thoughts, trying not to dwell on what they would do should they not be chosen. If he was not chosen, Pug, like the others, would be free to leave Cryde to try to find a craft in another town or city. If he stayed, he would have to either farm the Duke's land as a franklin or work one of the town's fishing boats. Both prospects were equally unattractive, but he couldn't imagine leaving Cryde. Pug remembered what Meager had told him the night before. The old cook had cautioned him about fretting too much over the choosing. After all, he had pointed out, there were many apprentices who never advanced to the rank of journeyman when all things were taken into account. There were more men without craft in Cryde than with. Meager had glossed over the fact that many fishers' and farmers' sons forsook the choosing, electing to follow their fathers. Pug wondered if Meager was so removed from his own choosing he couldn't remember that the boys who were not chosen would stand before the assembled company of craftmasters, householders, and newly chosen apprentices under their gaze until the last name was called and they were dismissed in shame. Biting his lower lip, Pug tried to hide his nervousness. He was not the sort to jump from the heights of sailor's grief should he not be chosen, as some had done in the past. But he couldn't bear the idea of facing those who had been chosen. Thomas, who stood next to his shorter friend, threw Pug a smile. He knew Pug was fretting, but could not feel entirely sympathetic as his own excitement mounted. His father had admitted that he would be the first called by Swordmaster Fannin. Moreover, the Swordmaster had confided that should Thomas do well in training, he might be found a place in the Duke's personal guard. It would be a signal honour, and would improve Thomas's chance for advancement, even earning him an officer's rank after 15 or 20 years in the guard. He poked Pug in the ribs with an elbow, for the Duke's herald had come out upon the balcony overlooking the courtyard. The herald signalled to a guard, who opened the small door in the great gate, and the craft masters entered. They crossed to stand at the foot of the broad stairs of the keep. As was traditional, they stood with their backs to the boys, waiting upon the Duke. The large oaken doors of the keep began to swing out ponderously, and several guards in the Duke's brown and gold darted through to take up their position on the steps. Upon each tabard was emblazoned the golden gull of Cridey, and above that a small golden crown, marking the Duke a member of the royal family. The herald shouted, "Hearken to me! His Grace Boric Conduin, 3rd Duke of Cridey, Prince of the Kingdom, Lord of Cridey, Cusp and Tulan, Warden of the West, Knight General of the King's armies, heir presumptive to the throne of Rhiannon." The Duke stood patiently while the list of officers was completed, and then stepped forward into the sunlight. Past 50, the Duke of Cridey still moved with the fluid grace and powerful step of a born warrior. Except for the grey at the temples of his dark brown hair, he looked younger than his age by 20 years. He was dressed from neck to boot in black, as he had been for the last 7 years, for he still mourned the loss of his beloved wife Catherine. At his side hung a black scabbard sword with a silver hilt, and upon his hand his ducal signet ring, the only ornamentation he permitted himself. The herald raised his voice. "Their Royal Highnesses, their Princes Liam Conduin and Arutha Conduin, heirs to the House of Cridey, Knight Captains of the King's Army of the West, Princes of the Royal House of Rhiannon." Both sons stepped forward to stand behind their father. The 2 young men were 6 and 4 years older than the apprentices, the Duke having wed late, but the difference between the awkward candidates for apprenticeship and the sons of the Duke was much more than a few years in age. Both princes appeared calm and self-possessed. Liam, the older, stood on his father's right, a blonde, powerfully built man. His open smile was the image of his mother's, and he looked always on the verge of laughter. He was dressed in a bright blue tunic and yellow leggings, and wore a closely trimmed beard, as blonde as his shoulder-length hair. Arutha was to shadows and night as Liam was to light and day. He stood nearly as tall as his brother and father, but while they were powerfully built, he was rangy to the point of gauntness. He wore a brown tunic and russet leggings. His hair was dark, and his face clean-shaven. Everything about Arutha gave one the feeling of quickness. His strength was in his speed with the rapier, speed with wit. His humour was dry and often sharp. While Liam was openly loved by the Duke's subjects, Arutha was respected and admired for his ability, but not regarded with warmth by the people. Together the 2 sons seemed to capture most of the complex nature of their sire, for the Duke was capable of both Liam's robust humour and Arutha's dark moods. They were nearly opposites in temperament, but both capable men who would benefit the duchy and kingdom in years to come. The Duke loved both his sons. The herald again spoke. "The Princess Carline, daughter of the royal house." The slim and graceful girl who made her entrance was the same age as the boys who stood below. but already beginning to show the poise and grace of one born to rule and the beauty of her late mother. Her soft yellow gown contrasted strikingly with her nearly black hair. Her eyes were Liam's blue, as their mother's had been, and Liam beamed when his sister took their father's arm. Even Arutha ventured one of his rare half smiles, for his sister was dear to him also. Many boys in the keep harboured a secret love for the princess, a fact that she often turned to her advantage when there was mischief afoot, but even her presence could not drive the day's business from their minds. The Duke's court then entered. Pug and Thomas could see that all the members of the Duke's staff were present, including Colgan. Pug had glimpsed him in the castle from time to time since the night of the storm, and they had exchanged words once, Colgan inquiring as to his well-being, but mostly the magician was absent from sight. Pug was a little surprised to see the magician, for he was not properly considered a full member of the Duke's household, but rather a sometime adviser. Most of the time, Colgan was ensconced in his tower, hidden from view, as he did whatever magicians do in such places. The magician was in deep conversation with Father Tully, a priest of Astalon the builder and one of the Duke's oldest aides. Tully had been adviser to the Duke's father and had seemed old then. He now appeared ancient, at least to Pug's youthful perspective. But his eyes betrayed no sign of senility. Many a keep boy had been impaled upon the pointed gaze of those clear grey eyes. His wit and tongue were equally youthful, and more than once a keep boy had wished for a session with Horsemaster Algan's leather strap, rather than a tongue lashing from Father Tully. The white-haired priest could nearly strip the skin from a miscreant's back with his caustic words. Nearby stood one who experienced Tully's wrath upon occasion, Squire Roland, son of Baron Talbot of Toulon, one of the Duke's vassals. He was companion to both princes, being the only other boy of noble birth in the keep. His father had sent him to Crichton the year before to learn something of the management of the duchy and the ways of the Duke's court. In the rather rough frontier court, Roland discovered a home away from home. He was already something of a rogue when he arrived, but his infectious sense of humour and ready wit often eased much of the anger that resulted from his prankish ways. It was Roland more often than not who was Princess Carline's accomplice in whatever mischief she was embarked upon. With light brown hair and blue eyes, Roland stood tall for his age. He was a year older than the gathered boys, and had played often with them over the last year, as Liam and Arutha were frequently busy with court duties. Thomas and he had been boyish rivals at first, then fast friends, with Pug becoming his friend by default, because where Thomas was, Pug was certain to be nearby. Roland saw Pug fidgeting near the edge of the assembled boys and gave him a slight nod and wink. Pug grinned briefly, for while he was often the butt of Roland's jokes as any other, he still found himself liking the wild young squire. After all his court was in attendance, the Duke spoke. Yesterday was the last day of the 11th year of the reign of our Lord King Roderick IV. Today is the festival of Benapus. The following day will find these boys gathered here, counted among the men of Crichton, boys no longer, but apprentices and freemen. At this time it is proper for me to inquire if any among you wishes to be released from service to the duchy. Are there any among you who so wish? The question was formal in nature, and no response was expected, for few ever wished to leave Crichton, but one boy did step forward. The herald asked, "Who seeks release of his service?" The boy looked down, clearly nervous. Clearing his throat, he said, I am Robert, son of Hugon." Pug knew him, but not well. He was a net mender's son, a town boy, and they rarely mixed with the keep boys. Pug had played with him upon a few occasions, and had a sense the lad was well regarded. It was a rare thing to refuse service, and Pug was as curious as any to hear the reasons. The Duke spoke kindly. "What is your purpose, Robert, son of Hugon?" "Your Grace, my father is unable to take me into his craft, for my 4 brothers are well able to ascend to the craft as journeymen and masters after him, as are many other net menders' sons. My eldest brother is now married and has a son of his own, so my family no longer has room for me in the house. If I may not stay with my family and practice my father's craft, I beg your Grace's leave to take service as a sailor." The Duke considered the matter. Robert was not the first village boy to be called by the lure of the sea. "Have you found a master willing to take you into his company?" "Yes, your Grace. Captain Gregson, master of the ship Green Deep from Margrave's port, is willing." "I know this man," said the Duke, smiling slightly. He said, "He is a good and fair man. I recommend you into his service and wish you well in your travels. You will be welcomed at Crichton whenever you return with your ship." Robert bowed a little stiffly and left the courtyard, his part in the choosing done. Pug wondered at Robert's adventuresome choice. In less than a minute the boy had renounced his ties with his family and home, and was now a citizen of a city he had never seen. It was custom that a sailor was considered to owe his loyalty to the city that was his ship's home port. Margrave's port was one of the free cities of Natal, on the bitter sea, and was now Robert's home. The Duke indicated the herald should continue. The herald announced the first of the craftmasters, Sailmaker Holm, who called the names of 3 boys. All 3 took service, and none seemed displeased. The choosing went smoothly, as no boy refused service. Each boy went to stand next to his new master. As the afternoon wore on and the number of boys diminished, Pug became more and more uncomfortable. Soon there were only 2 boys besides Pug and Thomas standing in the centre of the court. All the craftsmasters had called their apprentices, and only 2 of the Duke's household staff beside the swordmaster had not been heard from. Pug studied the group on top of the steps, his heart pounding with anxiety. The 2 princes regarded the boys, Liam with a friendly smile, Arutha brooding on some thought or another. The Princess Carline was bored by the entire affair, and took little pains to hide the fact as she was whispering to Roland. This brought a disapproving look from Lady Marna, her governess. Horsemaster Algan came forth, his brown and golden tabard bearing a small horse head embroidered over his left breast. The horsemaster called the name of Rolf, son of Dick, and the stocky son of the Duke's stableman walked over to stand behind the master. When he turned, he smiled condescendingly at Pug. The 2 boys had never gotten along, the pox-scarred boy spending many hours taunting and tormenting Pug. While they both worked in the stable under Dick, the stableman had looked the other way whenever his son sprang a trap on Pug, and the orphan was always held responsible for any difficulty that arose. It had been a terrible period for Pug, and the boy had vowed to refuse service rather than face the prospect of working next to Rolf the rest of his life. Housecarl Samuel called the other boy Geoffrey, who would become a member of the castle's serving staff, leaving Pug and Thomas standing alone. Swordmaster Fannin then stepped forward, and Pug felt his heart stand still as the old soldier called, "Thomas, son of Meagher." There was a pause, and Pug waited to hear his own name called, but Fannin stepped back, and Thomas crossed over to stand alongside him. Pug felt dwarfed by the gaze of all upon him. The courtyard was now larger than he had ever remembered it, and he felt ill-fashioned and poorly dressed. His heart sank in his chest as he realised that there was no craftmaster or staff member present who had not taken an apprentice. He would be the only boy uncalled. Fighting back tears, he waited for the Duke to dismiss the company. As the Duke started to speak, sympathy for the boy showing clearly in his face, he was interrupted by another voice. "Your Grace, if you would be so kind." All eyes turned to see Colgan, the magician, step forward. "I have need of an apprentice, and would call Pug, orphan of the keep, to service. And that is where I'm leaving it today, lovely people. I hope you enjoyed this part of chapter 2, and we will pick up again tomorrow. Have a lovely evening. Good night, sweet dreams, and see you tomorrow.